Welcome to the Businesstalk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. Today we are delighted to welcome Dr. Barbara Larson, Executive Professor of Management at Northeastern University's D. Amore McKim School of Business and a leading expert on remote and hybrid work, digital transformation, and the human side of technology. Dr. Larson teaches across executive, graduate, and undergraduate audiences, focusing on how people and organizations navigate digital transformation, innovate effectively, thrive in remote and hybrid settings, and build high-performing teams. Her research examines how technology shapes human behavior at work. Her work on remote and hybrid work has appeared in leading academic and practitioner outlets, including Harvard Business Review, Strategic Management Journal, and Academy of Management Perspectives, and has affected coverage from major media such as the New York Times, USA Today, The Economist, NBC, BBC, and Bloomberg. Her lead authored editorial, Critical Thinking in the Era of Generative AI, published in Academy of Management, Learning and Education, has become the journal's most downloaded editorial. Before entering academia, she spent 15 years in international finance and operations leadership, culminating in the role of Director of International Finance at R.R. Donnelley, and she holds a DBA from Harvard Business School, an MBA from Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and a BA from the University of Virginia. In this episode, Dr. Barbara Larson shares insights from her acclaimed book, Remote and Hybrid Work, What Everyone Needs to Know, published by Oxford University Press. It's my pleasure to now welcome Dr. Barbara Larson to the conversation. Dr. Barbara, thank you for graciously accepting our invitation. We are truly honored by your presence and deeply grateful for the time you have shared with us today.
Thank you, Deepak. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Professor, many organizations still mix in office, hybrid and fully remote roles under one roof. How
Mhm.
should leaders think about designing work so that these different arrangements feel fair and cohesive rather than fragmented?
Well, I think, a common theme that we'll probably talk about over the next, 40 minutes or so is the issue of design. And in fact, I think one of the things that companies that are doing this well do is actually intentionally design their work structure. I think it used to be, especially before COVID, it used to be much more common to see what we academics sometimes call idiosyncratic deals, where you would have some people that had made a deal to work hybrid and other people that were fully remote and other people that were, required to come into the office. I think we've seen since COVID a situation where that is becoming less of a phenomenon because companies did go all remote, or most companies did during COVID. And so they're now realizing the issue of fairness and cohesion. I think what is less apparent or is not going on as much yet is companies optimizing that design. And so I think that is more the issue where there's either a lack of clear communication about the objectives of work design, or in many cases that we're seeing in the media now, there's become this sort of across the board, everybody, we're either going all remote or we're going all back into the office without any sort of thought for the type of work that people are doing. And I think that, executives are doing that in part at these across the board, one size fits all designs, I think are intended in part to feel fair, right? Like, well, everybody has to do this. But in fact, they don't recognize the very different types of work that people are doing, and they're not optimizing, right? So if anything, I think having a well designed, well explained, communicated mix can be optimal. It's usually where either in the design or the communication that things are falling apart.
Professor, when you look back at the evolution of remote work before, during, and after COVID-19 pandemic, what do you see as the most persistent myths that still shape organizational decisions today?
Yeah, so I would actually say there's two that immediately come to mind, and then a third that's kind of a result. So the two that immediately come to mind are remote work decreases productivity. The second is remote work increases productivity. And so what you see so much of these days is people holding one philosophy or the other, right? I mean, I've even seen people in my field, academics, who have positioned themselves as remote work advocates. And I mean, I think to me that is a mistake, right? And I always say I'm not an advocate, I'm a scholar of remote work because remote work can go either way, right? I've been involved in research that shows evidence that for some types of jobs, in some types of situations, remote work does increase productivity. And in fact, work from anywhere, where people are allowed to live wherever they want, further increases productivity. But that is not true across the board. That's not true for all jobs. Similarly, with these return to office mandates, you see, people making the assumption that remote work has decreased productivity, decreased collaboration, decreased, cultural cohesion. That's also not true. And I think that leads me to my third myth, which is that I think many people view in many managers, leaders have mistakenly viewed remote work policy or hybrid work policy as being limited to a number of days in the office per week. And that is just the beginning of a hybrid work policy. That's not the ending point. And so where we see companies struggle with, enhancing productivity, attracting talent, retaining talent, et cetera, with hybrid or remote work, it's typically that they have stopped at the point of, number of days per week and not gone on to think then about, okay, now what are we going to do with those in-office days? What are we going to do with the out-of-office days? And how are we going to design the hybrid work? And I think that's the part that is often missing.
Professor, from your research, what personal traits or work styles seem to help individuals thrive in remote or hybrid roles? And how can managers support people who may not necessarily fit that profile?
So, I mean, this is a really interesting question that I mean, I've been doing research on remote and hybrid work since 2013. And that was one of the first questions that I had going into this. And I remember thinking it must be a personality trait, right? Or a set of personality traits. And there's some evidence, but it's pretty much correlational, right? So you can't assume causation here that, if you, that the personality traits are the thing causing remote work to go better or worse. But the correlations that we see, the strongest correlations that we've seen over the years now, typically focus on a few things. One is conscientiousness, the personality trait of conscientiousness. And I mean, honestly, conscientiousness is correlated with better work outcomes in almost any setting. So sure, yes, it will help with remote work, but frankly, it'll help in just about any work setting. So, but that is one. Another one is proactivity, right, which is, a little obviously can be somewhat correlated with conscientiousness. Proactivity is, having the sort of the tendency to reach out, take initiative. And so for somebody who is working remotely, that can support behaviors that involve communicating well, say over media, over technologically mediated means, and doing the extra communication that's needed in a virtual setting. Another one is people with high emotional stability, or in my field we sometimes call it low neuroticism. Those folks tend to get less stressed out about things. They're generally less nervous, and less emotionally reactive, and so that can help because it is easier in a remote setting to have situations where, you get an email and you misinterpret the tone and it seems like the person's upset with you, and, when maybe they're not. A person with higher emotional stability is less likely to have an immediate negative reaction, and to take the time to to figure out what's going on. So that can help. And then I think the one that people always wonder about is introversion versus extroversion. And there is definitely some limited evidence indicating that introverts suffer less from loneliness and isolation in a more remote work setting than extroverts. That said, that is not a universal law. There are plenty of extroverts who are very happy working remotely. Also, for introverts, if you have an introvert who is working remotely, they are also going to have, they're going to experience loneliness and isolation. I mean, introverts are people who regain emotional energy from having time on their own and time working on their own and quiet. But that doesn't mean that they don't ever get lonely or that they want isolation. And so I think, the extroversion, introversion question tends to be the thing that people go to quickly. And in fact, it's only sort of true around the margins. And I think that is an interesting transition into how managers can support people. I think one thing is I always talk to my students and I say, look, personality is only one part of what influences behavior. And it's a significant part, but it's not a deterministic part. And so there are lots of other things that can cause us to behave in certain ways that are, sort of hopefully improvements on our base level personality traits. And so one of the levers for that is developing what's often called your emotional intelligence, right? Your ability, your self-awareness about what your tendencies are, and then finding ways to meet those needs that are not detrimental to others. But also your ability to self-regulate, your ability to empathize with other people, and so understanding what remote others might, be dealing with themselves, and developing the skill and ability to form social ties with others. So certainly managers, I think, that support the development of those elements of emotional intelligence can definitely help employees get better at remote work. I think also the other big piece that I often, talk about in terms of influence on behavior is the situation. And so, our who we are as a person is only part of what predicts our behavior. The other piece is the situation that we're put into. And so obviously managers have a large influence on the situation that we're put into. And that can range from, our workspace at home, if we're working from home, the communication media that we're given, the way that hybrid work is scheduled. So who we're working with and what we're doing when we're in the office versus at home. And so that's where I really try to focus managers on is how can you create a situation that is going to best enable the people in your team, in your group, in your company to do their best work and really again I always talk about optimizing, right, as opposed to minimizing or maximizing. It's optimizing. How can you squeeze the best things out of remote work and the best things of being in the office and find that sweet spot in the middle.
Professor, digital tools now allow unprecedented monitoring of employees. In your view, where is the line between legitimate performance visibility and harmful surveillance? And how can organizations avoid crossing it?
So it's a really interesting question. First of all, I just want to say, legal constraints and regulations vary by country. And so I think the first thing that any company should be thinking about is obviously, respecting the law. And that will be very different in different countries. But then assuming that you're working within whatever is considered legal, I think, the analogy that I often use for monitoring is, and I'm not sure this will completely translate culturally, but you can tell me, Deepak, is Big Brother versus Fitbit or, Apple Watch or any kind of fitness watch that you wear. So Big Brother, that comes from George Orwell, 1984, and it really refers to having this sort of punitive, monitor that is constantly watching you and wants to catch you doing something bad. Or if you step out of line, you're going to be in big trouble, right? And so, some companies have actually taken approaches like that. I saw a lot of that in the early days of COVID, that companies that had not experienced remote work before were so honestly terrified of losing what they perceived to be control over their workers that they started taking these, very kind of big brother approaches to monitoring, and ended up with all kinds of unintended negative consequences from that. That type of monitoring tends to be very harmful to employee motivation. And it can actually cause some of your best talent to leave and look for other situations. There's actually some evidence that employees under that type of monitoring will actually do things. They'll spend more time focused on how to work around the monitoring and kind of cheat the system than they will on actually doing better work. And so you're really undermining yourself as an employer by engaging in that kind of monitoring. The other kind that I called Fitbit or Apple Watch, if you think of like, I have, a device on my wrist that is constantly like giving me little pings. You need to stand up and walk around for a minute. You haven't taken that many steps. You need to get a little more exercise, or you're about to miss a meeting, and so that is this device is monitoring me, right? But it's monitoring me with an eye toward the good and toward, and it does. And if I do something well, it tells me that too, right? Yay, you made your fitness goals for today. Um, and I think that kind of monitoring that is more for the employee's own self-understanding can be so valuable, and motivating. And so if employees, so I think that the keys that we see in the research is employees need to receive a transparent explanation of what the monitoring technology is and what it's being used for first. And then second, they need to see some benefit in it for their own development, and including both positive and constructive reinforcement. And then it becomes a motivator. It becomes like a companion, as opposed to being, sort of this authoritarian, tool of control, which is usually pretty damaging.
Professor, some companies have experimented with going fully remote and eliminating physical offices altogether.
Mhm.
What patterns do you see in the organizations that sustain that model successfully versus those that struggle or reverse course?
So I think again, this goes back to the earlier theme of design and intentionality. It also goes up a little bit back to issues of the type of work that's being done, and the size of the company also. So if we take those one by one, first of all, the type of work matters. Some types of work lend themselves better to asynchronous coordination, right? And so that's, coordinating through a technological platform as opposed to, coordinating through synchronous conversation. And so, if you're doing that type of work, say, some type of software development, for instance, and then you can actually benefit from having a worldwide work from anywhere kind of setting, because you can ride the time zones and you can essentially have work going on 24 hours a day as it goes around the world. On the other hand, if you're in a business that does require much more, in-person synchronous interaction, sorry, not necessarily in person, but synchronous interaction, then, the sort of all remote becomes more challenging, not only because of the time zone setting, but also because you don't have anywhere that people can meet up even if they want to. It's interesting. And I should preface this by saying that this is all remote is not my area of focus, right? There are others like Raj Chowdhury at LSE who do much more work on this. But I think that one of the companies that I've been intrigued by lately is Shopify. And so Shopify has, I'm going to say maybe 10,000 employees. And so it's a decent sized company. And it had offices before COVID, and it still has some offices, but it stopped requiring people to work in those offices. In 2023, it allowed people to start going into certain offices when they wanted to meet. And then later on, sometime within about a year after that, it started designing schedules such that it was organizing around when people went in the office and when they didn't. So Shopify is kind of interesting because on one hand, it's a relatively large company. Most truly all remote companies that you see are kind of 2,500 people or less, right? So one of the largest is GitHub, sorry, GitLab, and uh, and then Automatic is another one. Um, and those have been, they've been all remote since their start. They have grown. They're now in the neighborhood of, I think, 2,000 people. And so they have, as they've grown, they've designed to all remote. But then, Shopify is different. It's a company that's come at it from a different angle. And so you've seen much more transparently some of the design decisions that they've made along the way as they've supported this basically all remote model. And so I think, but in both cases, they have types of work that lend themselves well. The size, I think, becomes more difficult as you get bigger. Coordination costs increase, right? As a company gets bigger, and it also becomes more difficult to create a cohesive culture as an organization gets bigger. And frankly, the costs of not having any kind of physical office can start to exceed the costs of having a physical office because every time you want to get people together, you have to find somewhere to do that and you have to pay for it. So there are reasons why we don't see a lot of very large companies working in an all remote model. But I think the companies that have tried it and moved back are the ones who have not done this sort of purposeful design of the work, right? And so, if we look at Shopify's model, it's, for instance, when they're more recent moves that they've made are to say, okay, we have, one day a week. If you have to have a large meeting, like kind of a town hall meeting, this is the time that you can do it, right? On, I think it's Thursdays from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern time. Like that's it. And then Wednesdays are no meeting days, right? Individual work. And so you would assume that you're not going to get many people in the office that day, other than the ones who want to escape a chaotic home environment and come in and do individual work, right? And so what those types of this is what I mean by design. When people do things like this, when companies develop design like that, then you're giving employees the opportunity to manage their workflows to optimize to remote versus in-office work and asynchronous versus synchronous interaction. And so that's the piece that I think that, many companies just don't, barely even consider, and for a variety of reasons, may choose not to do. Because they feel like, I think some managers feel like when they do that, they're dictating workflows too much. But in fact, if you put those constraints around the workflows, it's actually organizing the work. and making it easier for employees to then sort of establish a routine, establish a cadence week to week that allows them to optimize.
Professor, how do remote and hybrid arrangements change the experience of office-based employees who remain on-site most of the time? And what can leaders do to prevent a two-tier culture from emerging?
So that's a really relevant question to today. I think this is something that a lot of employers are struggling with. So there's sort of two pieces to that actually, because it kind of works in both directions. One is that one thing that we learned during COVID is and we continue to see it in the data, by the way. I was looking at work from home data from some research, recent research just yesterday, and you see as education levels and sort of professional levels increase, remote work increases, right? So in one sense, having the ability to work remotely is almost become like a status signal, right? And so that's so you think of that as like a tiering, right? A higher versus lower tier. But then on the flip side, there's also loads of evidence that people who are in the office less and working from home more, on balance, have a tougher time when it comes to things like promotions. And so then, you get the people in the office who are benefiting from it. And that's one of the things that's leading right now. The data indicates that employees are taking, not, it's not a huge difference, but they're taking slightly less time working from home than their employer plans actually allow. And I think probably some of that has to do with this sense that if I'm not showing up, at least when my boss is in the office, then I may be I may be forgotten about when it comes time for promotions. So there's sort of two almost countervailing forces there. Um, I think that and by the way, and I should say also, this is something that preceded COVID. So there was a really interesting article that was written by Kevin Rockman and Michael Pratt back. I think it came out in 2015. That was sort of the first documentation of what they called like the lonely office. And so this was well before COVID. You already had in some professional services types firms, offices where there were so many people working from home that the people coming in would discover that they didn't have anybody to meet with, they didn't have anybody to socialize with. Another thing that we've seen a lot since COVID is, I think one thing that we've learned pretty clearly is that when you are having meetings, if they are meant to be collaborative meetings, you really want to avoid having these hybrid kinds of meetings where some people are sitting in person and other people are on a screen on the wall. Those are considered to be pretty suboptimal. And so then what happens is that employees come into the office for their in-office work days and then end up spending all their time on Zoom or Teams, in online meetings. So all of these things are sort of creating various types of tiering. And so in one sense, it's easy to go, well, it all evens out in the end, right? And because it isn't sort of unidirectional. But I think again, and I'm sorry to sound like a broken record, but I think again, this is where design becomes important. And so certainly having meetings be either all in person or all online is a helpful way to reduce the effects of, who's in the office. Oh, this is the in group that's sitting in the conference versus those of us who are at home. It's a way to level the playing field. But again, then strategically scheduling people so that so that if you do have people who need to work together synchronously and who really do benefit from that, that they are being scheduled in a way that enables that. I think one of the biggest mistakes that I saw in I guess I would call it mid to late COVID era, when we were starting to come back to the office, was very large companies saying something along the lines of, I mean, you still see it today, but saying something along the lines of, we're going to allow our employees to work from home 2 days a week or 3 days a week or, one day a week, and they get to pick which days. And I just, and to me, that's like a horrible mistake because employees will, and it's great to give employees choice. I mean, don't get me wrong, right? I'm all for giving employees choice where you can. But in my mind, that is not one of those where you can things, right? You need to be able to say, okay, in my team needs us to be in the office, these 3 days a week. And then maybe you give the employees, if they're working one day a week from home, you give them the choice of the other 2 days. But you are saying, like, this is what the work needs. And I think some of the most successful models I've seen have this kind of overarching company policy, but then part of the company policy is that individual teams um, are able to design and in fact are told that they need to design their schedules around their need for synchronous interaction. And so that's what I mean by strategic scheduling. And so I think that's probably the number one thing that companies can do to avoid this sort of, because I think people often develop ideas about status and when there's an absence of more information, right? We often say political behavior it increases in a vacuum of information. And so if you have reasons for the scheduling and the reasons are clearly related to the business, and then give employees some choice within those constraints, I think that actually goes a long way to eliminating some of these status issues.
Professor, if a CEO asks you for a short checklist before announcing a major shift to hybrid work, what are the
Mm.
top 3 or 4 questions they must answer clearly for both managers and employees?
I mean, I think pretty straightforward. I think first of all, the CEO for themselves needs to have a clear view of the benefits, right? So often where you've seen very publicly where you've seen remote work fail is where the CEOs themselves don't believe in or haven't really looked at the research or just don't like remote work and they don't have a clear view of how it can benefit the business. And I think that, at the end of the day, this is a business. And so there has to be a clear view of how remote work can benefit the business. Now, there's a number of ways that it can, right? One of the biggest is recruitment and retention. And so people, companies that enable at least hybrid work will be much more appealing and will be able to recruit and retain better talent, sometimes at lower cost than companies who don't. So that's one. But the other then is a question also of productivity, that in some cases, remote work does enhance productivity. And so there needs to be a clear sort of value proposition to the remote work. And so that's the first. I think the second thing is a clear-eyed view of the challenges. And so, there have been, I've certainly seen companies where CEOs are like, have drunk the Kool-Aid of remote work and increased productivity, and they're like, woo, let's do it. And they don't have a clear view of what the management challenges are. Increasingly, in the work I've been doing lately, I've been on several different studies, and we've been studying different variables and different types of workers in different countries. And we keep coming back to this idea that the manager matters, right? At there's the manager behaviors more than almost anything else, including number of days per week in the office, have such a huge influence on how employees experience hybrid and remote work. And so I think, the CEO needs to have a clear-eyed view of the management challenges that exist, and then needs to be messaging very clearly to managers. This is part of your job. It's not just that you have a workforce that happens to be part or all remote. You're responsible for undertaking really, solid remote hybrid work management practices, and then obviously making sure they're getting training in those practices. I think that, it's not having that understanding that it does change the role of a manager. It really often derails companies that just kind of go into it.
Professor, remote and hybrid work can reshape cities, infrastructure, community patterns, and even family life. Which societal effects, positive or negative, do you think policymakers and business leaders are still underestimating?
That's an interesting one. I think the one that really sticks out to me right now is the potential of remote work to increase diversity in the workforce. And by diversity, here I'm more talking about things like neurodiversity, bringing in people into the workforce who may not be able to commute into an office either because of neurodiverse challenges or physical challenges also. I think, there's a really underutilized segment of the population that is, underemployed frequently, and really motivated to work, to contribute. And remote work gives, and I mean, we've seen this already, right? This is already happening. I think, though, that it has been happening for many, many years. But it's only been since COVID that we've had the really robust technology and familiarity with the technology among the entire workforce, such as, us sitting here very comfortably on Zoom, that now we're at a position where policymakers could really be leaning into using remote work as a way to get some of these underemployed members of our society back into the workforce. So I think that's one thing I'd really love to see. I think another one that I watch, and I'm not sure I have a strong point of view on at this point, but is the transformation of commercial downtown districts. And I think that there's been a lot of there initially, in the immediate sort of post-COVID period, there was a lot of focus on like we've got to get people back into the office so that we can revitalize downtowns. And I think that more forward-thinking policymakers are starting to think about, well, what is the purpose of a downtown in the era of, Zoom and virtual work? And so I'll be interested to see how that, the sort of new thinking about downtowns evolves over time.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Looking ahead 10 years, what realistic scenario for the new normal of work do you find most possible? And what should organizations start doing now to be ready for that future?
Mm. It's funny. I kind of feel like we're hitting the new normal now. Maybe that's wishful thinking on my part, but certainly if you look at the numbers, there's been a flattening out, and we appear to be reaching some kind of equilibrium in terms of the number of people working remotely, the number of days per week being worked remotely on average. You're seeing more stability in the numbers over the last couple of years. So I'm not sure that there's a lot other than what we've already talked about. I'm not sure there's a whole lot. The one area that I am really interested to see is in the both AI, and also extended reality technologies and how they are being brought to bear to enable more remoteness in work. There are one of my colleagues is doing some research on, digital twins and how that might end up, sort of enabling people to be in, more than one place at a time, which is kind of fascinating and terrifying to think about. I have seen certainly some interesting applications of both virtual reality and augmented reality to allow people to have different types of interactions in a remote setting. And in some cases, to do things remotely that in the past weren't possible, like some aspects of manufacturing. So those are the things I've got my eye on as we look to the future of work.
Listeners, thank you for joining for this insightful conversation with Dr. Barbara Larson on remote and hybrid work, digital transformation, and the evolving relationship between technology and human behavior at work. A reflection on how individuals, teams, and leaders can adapt to new ways of working offer practical direction for anyone navigating today's challenging workplace. The ideas shared by today will be valuable not only for managers and organizations, but also for professionals charting their own careers in this new landscape. Dr. Barbara Larson, thank you once again for sharing your time, experience, and research based insights with us today. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure, Deepak. Thank you.